Good morning. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yes, good morning and welcome. Welcome to the Wilson Center. It's good to see a few familiar faces and lots of new faces, so that's great. I know that many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center, but we've just gotten some new rankings about the center that I wanted to share with you. So the center has been ranked according to the University of Pennsylvania survey on think tanks as the number 5 U.S. think tank. We've maintained our ranking among the top 10 think tanks globally, and we are the top U.S. think tank to watch. So welcome to one of the top institutions. One of the things that we are most proud of in that ranking is that we have been ranked as the number 2 best transdisciplinary research program at a think tank. And we believe that that ranking is due to a lot of the work that we do across disciplines in our environmental change and security program. So we're delighted to be here in this context today to talk about high stakes, how this year's climate negotiations will impact national security. So I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. And we're particularly thrilled to welcome Nick Mabey back to the center and to have our longtime partner and colleague and senior advisor, Jeff DeBalco. Jeff, I don't know if you can see me, but Jeff is a long-time former director of the program, as many of you know, and continues to work with us as a senior advisor. We're meeting here today thanks to our support and continued collaboration with USAID. Our event is being sponsored by our Resilience to Peace project, which we are carrying out in collaboration with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation under a new project. It's a 4-year initiative called the Resilience to Peace project, which we will be formally launching on March the 2nd. So keep an eye out for that event where we'll be talking more about the work that we plan to do under this area, Resilience to Peace, for the next 4 years. So I was particularly intrigued in chatting with Nick this morning. Nick was telling me a little bit about what he's been doing in the time that he has been here in Washington, D.C. And he said, you know, Roger Mark, I'm getting a bit bored with myself. He says, you know, I've been on message on these issues for a little while. This is an important issue that we've been talking about. And as he has said, you know, with colleagues like Jeff DeBalco, we've been working on this for a while, but we're convinced that we never want to let a good idea die. Nick was telling me a little bit about some of the good meetings he's had in the time that he's been in DC on this visit, and particularly opportunities for cooperation moving ahead, and particularly for conflict resilience. So Nick is going to be talking a little bit about that this morning. As you see from the bio sketch that you have, he's a chief executive and a founding director of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism, a non-profit European organization that's focused on accelerating the transition to sustainable development. What I particularly like about Nick's background is he has experience with the government, having served as a senior advisor in the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, leading work on national and international policy areas. But he's also had experience on the research side, having done a lot of work at the London Business School, and also has a sense of the non-profit sector, having been the head of economics and development at WWF UK. So a very rich background, very much in the trenches on these issues. So I'm going to hand it over to Nick to share some of his thoughts and perspectives with us. Nick will talk for about 20-25 minutes. Then we'll have some comments from Jeff DeBalco, and then we'll have a discussion with you. So Nick, welcome, and I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me back. I always like being here. I always like Jeff digging into my work and pointing out all its problems, which is great. And just for the record, E3G is the 12th most important global environmental think tank, according to the same index. But we're only 10 years old last year, so we're still in our early teens, getting into our early adolescence, so it's all right. So thank you. It's great to be here. As you say, what I'm going to try and talk about today is about why this year matters for security and conflict resolution, and just because security is a word that looks simple but does not translate between countries, I will tell you. When we talk about security, we're not talking about just the military, we're talking about everything to energy, food, migration, the broad sense of security as spoken by heads of government, as opposed to includes the military but not just hard security. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to not go through all the slides, but they'll be circulated later because some of this is just meant to be an impression. A slightly diverse audience. I have to go through some stuff people may have seen before, otherwise it won't make any sense. And if you're wondering why there's an egg with the world painted on it on the slide, we'll get to that later. So just to say, this analysis is based on a wide range of E3G's work, including our work on security here and in Europe, on security strategies, but we also do a kind of quite deep political analysis around the UNFCCC process and climate diplomacy, and political economy mapping of key countries, though most of our work is actually trying to change energy and diplomatic policy in countries. So this is kind of the top notes of a lot of depth, so I would be very interested to answer more deep questions. What am I going to say? Always good to start with the end. 2015 matters. We all know climate change is impacting security this year across not just the Paris negotiations and climate change, but the Sustainable Development Goals, Montreal Protocol. Will have a material impact not just on the forward look, but also on immediate economic, geopolitical, and budgetary priorities. And that's the important one, budgetary priorities. That gets people's attention. But it's not the Super Bowl or the Cup final, as I would really say, because we're not going to get an end state regime where we can say we are definitely on a track to 2 degrees or off a track to 2 degrees, we've solved it, not solved it. But we need to do enough. We need to do enough to not be in a very risky space on climate risk. We need to deliver investment certainty, because that's what matters, and public confidence. And the third bullet point I've never written before. The US is successfully shaping the climate regime. It's nice to have you back. Sorry, Europe's kind of disappeared. But yeah, US diplomacy has worked, and it is shaping other people's positions, especially China and India. But we're still a bit worried about whether you're here to stay. And talking to senior politicians, there's a fear of backsliding in US diplomacy. Are the promises you're making really going to be redeemable from 2020 to 2030? Because as things change, yeah. And the last point is that we need to integrate security in this broader sense, into the climate regime. Because it's a foundation of bilateral relationships. It's already affecting US and other planning and deployments. But there's really massive opportunity, we think, for reforms which would improve stability and security, reduce pressure on both the European and US militaries, but also strengthen alliance and resilience. So that's where I want to go today. This bit of climate science. It's not really climate science, but I think just a few high notes. You probably haven't seen this graph. This is temperature proxy for the last 100,000 years. The climate is not stable. Human civilization, agriculture, is the bit at the top that is stable. We did not get agriculture because we got clever. We got agriculture because the climate got stable and it became a good survival approach. So just realize that. The climate is bouncy. And this is carbon dioxide over 100,000, I'd say nearly 1 million years going back. One of the drivers of that fluctuation is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There are others. We are pushing it, if you see where the dots are, way, way outside where it's been for the last 1 million years. It's got a risky, bouncy, volatile system, which we only have advanced civilization when it's stable, and we're now pushing that system, one of the core drivers of that system, way outside geological boundaries. And this is real climate science, this is climate modeling. So this is, often people say, oh, we need to keep things within 2 degrees. That is a meaningless statement without any qualifications. How much probability? Uncertainties everywhere. So these are probability distributions of, and there's temperature on the y-axis. It's 3 scenarios of how much carbon we put in the atmosphere. So the first one, which is the highest emission scenario, that would give me a 50% chance of being below 3 degrees C, but as you see, a 10% chance of being around 6 to 7 degrees. That's double the last ice age difference, just to give you a broad idea of what that means. So if someone says, well, 2's a bit difficult, should we go to 3? That's what that means in risk terms. If you say, well, half-half, 50-50 chance of 2, that's okay. That gives us a 10% chance of 4 to 5. Still 1 ice age away the wrong way. You think large climatic changes. you have to be at 66% chance of being below 2 degrees C to minimize risk. The UK, though we sign up to the 2-degree global goal, signed up by all global leaders, that's not our national policy. Our national policy is limiting the risk of 4 degrees to a 1% chance, because we think that's more meaningful in terms of managing our climate security. So the 2 degrees, 66% kind of translates in that. But realize you've got to understand the risk if you know what you're planning for. And why does that matter? I mean, we can talk about impacts, but this is tipping points for those of you who understand tipping points to say what parts of the global system which regulate the climate, whether it's the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets or the Amazon or the monsoons in West Africa or India, will flip irreversibly at what temperature. We don't know much about this, to be honest. This is one scientist's or scientific group's estimate. Red means more likely than not. White means won't happen. Yellow, you know, somewhere between 50 and 0 and 50%. At 2 degrees, everything's in the low probability range. You go up to 4 degrees, most of those tipping points, which leads to runaway climate change, are in the more likely than not range. That's why we have a policy in the UK of keeping 4 degrees below 1%. So again, if you want to understand what risk we're taking, which is what security analysts do, you have to understand these basics. This is to go to top level, because the whole metric for the rest of the talk is how close are we to maintaining reliably below 2 degrees? What's this regime doing us for limiting our risk? So we have to know what risks we care about. I'm not going to go through the links between climate change and security, because lots of much more important people than me have said what they are, and people probably know them. But the takeaway at the bottom was quite good. A new foreign policy poll that 41% of US experts think climate change is a top US foreign policy priority. Surprised me. I'm not sure if you get the same result in Europe, but it shows that it's not a controversial issue, which when we started doing this in the mid-2000s, it was. But again, what does that really mean? What does that really mean in practice? It means that the past won't be a guide to the future, and old models. Climate change is going to change how we work together, our relationships, our interests, our borders, our economic advantages, the public's confidence in the UN system, a whole lot of areas. It's not just conflict and instability on the ground, it's how the whole global system works to project stability, resilience, peace. That's what's on the big picture. And it requires us to take a much more preventative approach, again, not just on reducing climate emissions, but also building resilience into systems. We can't just learn by doing, because it will be too late. What does that mean in practical examples? Well, it's always interesting to look back at your old work and see how correct you were. Of course, I've chosen one where I was right, so that's a bit of a cheat. But in 2008, we said, everybody was talking about climate and conflict. We said, but think about it. Climate change is going to change our trade balance issues, our energy security as we move from cooperating with fuel producers to clean technology producers. Unconventional oil will be a contentious political issue. No one knew about unconventional oil in 2008. It was kind of a geeks issue. It'll disrupt markets. It may undermine trade rules. It may drive global resentment. Osama bin Laden had just given a statement demonizing the US on climate change policy. So that was what we thought the future might hold. I think we thought this would happen around 10 or 15 years. By 2015, that's the world we live in now. This is real. Climate change is a major element of US, China, and US-India diplomacy and European diplomacy. 80% of Europe's trade defense instruments, so countervailing duties, are on low-carbon goods in 2013. A large amount of that solar, but a lot of other things. 80%. Why? Because these are subsidized industries. We have had some really brutal disputes with China and the US on how, including aviation in our emissions trading system, and with Canada on tar sands regulation. Really high-level bribery, threats, horrible stuff. And our finance regulators are looking at whether the UK stock market will become unstable due to being overexposed to carbon stocks. That's what it looks like on the economic sphere. It's very real. On energy security, we're not going to build any new gas pipelines in Europe because our energy demand's falling because we have really good efficiency policy. That changes our relationship with Russia completely. It's a massive debate at the moment. 2008, we saw how extreme events, coupled with people putting export bans on, so trade responses, drove food prices and instability around the world. We ran that scenario 5 years before, and everybody said, oh, it'll never happen. Trade will stay flowing. The rules will be obeyed. Didn't happen. The Mediterranean is full of refugees driven by conflict, exacerbated by drought, and Arctic politics continue to grow. And we are seeing a massive growth of government repression of anti-coal activism, including in India, but also in places like Poland and Turkey, in our democratic friends. We're seeing a global fossil divestment campaign look like the anti-apartheid movement. And we saw 40,000 people march in Copenhagen and 400,000 people march in Paris. And there'll be a lot more people, so in New York, there'll be a lot more people in Paris, because the organizers tell me there'll be a lot more people. So this is a big issue, and I don't think that's reflected so much. And it's happened faster than we thought. And again, hotspots, a lot of issues about the Middle East, South Asia, water-driven conflicts, and Jeff knows much more about this than I do. We know where the problems are. The analysis is pretty clear across all NATO countries. We all basically agree where the stress is. Two takeaways why it matters. For the EU, it's our neighborhood. If that's a water stress map, red is bad. The EU neighbors at high risk. It's a high risk anyway, but trying to build stability in politically unstable countries which have too many people, too little water, no energy, and no markets is a challenge for Europe. But perhaps people don't realize that the challenge, particularly for the US, is it's probably the most domestically vulnerable OECD country. 37% of damages over the last, from extreme weather events over the last 30 years have been in the US. Half of that in Europe. We're a much more populated and larger country than you are, or region. You are very exposed. 10 years ago, we would have said the opposite. We would have said that Europe is more vulnerable than the US. So in our domestic interests, that's where we come through. So why does climate diplomacy matter? That's what the risk landscape is. Climate diplomacy matters because we need climate agreements to work. Why do we need climate agreements to work? Because to get below 2 degrees, we need to shift 90 trillion of investment from high carbon, which is going at the moment, to low carbon, efficient and resilient investment. And most of that is in developing countries, around 70 to 80%. So to preserve European and US security, we have to persuade other people to change the way they build their cities, their power stations, their roads, their transport systems, their economies. That's why we need diplomacy, because we cannot control it. We cannot force them to do it, we have to persuade them to do it. So that's why we need an agreement that manages climate risk, sends strong signals on investment, gives confidence we're all behaving, transparency and confidence, and we also have a ratchet if we're not going to get to 2 degrees so we can get ambition moving in the future. And we've made a lot of progress. Again, this is not about one little treaty in Paris. The climate regime contains a huge number of institutions, I won't go through all of them, but not just in negotiations, but implementing through major areas like the Green Climate Fund, ICAO, integrating into the Security Council, the World Bank's work. We have huge networks of civil society, cities, businesses engaged, and there's a little drawing of that. This is a very pared down view of the global climate regime. So when we talk about a regime, that's what we're talking about. Those institutions organized by the conversation in the middle, which is the global climate conversation, that says how much we're trying to do. But the doing is done in a lot of other places. So again, people say, oh, top down, bottom up, in the UNFCCC, outside UNFCCC. Dead questions. This is the reality. We are driving a multi-level, multi-institutional, broad, complicated regime, which takes an awful lot of diplomacy to make it work. And the bottom line is we don't have that diplomacy in place. Or the people to do it, political leadership to do it, if we want to achieve what we said we want to do. But the good thing is the wind's at our back. Things have changed a lot since Copenhagen, and mostly in the right direction, in the real world. People get that climate change is impacting now in the way they didn't before Copenhagen. Unfortunately, we've also probably breached a tipping point in the West Antarctic ice shelf. At least part of it is now irreversibly melting. We just don't know how quickly. So more sea level rise than we were expecting. Resource prices will remain volatile, and so countries are looking at efficiency as a major national security issue which has strong climate change byproducts. And lots of middle-income countries are taking large economic reforms in the next 5 to 10 years, which makes it easier to reorientate their economies. And around half to 90% of what they need to do to keep on a 2-degree track makes sense nationally in terms of health effects, pollution effects, energy security effects, and just saving money. So it's not pushing against economic logic. It's not expensive. It's actually just, it's quite hard to do. And the last one is renewable energy prices have dropped faster than anybody expected, and deployments are much faster. The only people who predicted the pace of renewable energy diffusion were Greenpeace, and Greenpeace underestimated how fast it was going to go in their most radical scenario. So there you are. People didn't estimate it. And also we're seeing power shift. So power in climate politics is shifting. In 1990, China had a quarter per capita emissions of the EU. Now we have the same emissions. We're seeing a shift from a north-south discussion, negotiations, to a combination of countries who are vulnerable, talking to countries who are making, who are climate makers, who put the emissions out there. And that's not complete, but it's a drift, and it's a change in dynamics. The economic opportunities are growing. There's around a 5 trillion low-carbon economy out there. We're looking at liberalization in a lot of agreements, including WTO and TTIP. And again, investment is a battleground, and that's another area. The rise of the BRICS Bank and the Asian Investment Bank, and what's the role of the World Bank? Will they compete over building infrastructure in countries? Will they maintain environmental safeguards? How do we make sure we don't have a battle for influence over who's going to build people's airports or roads, which undermines our agenda on climate change? That's a big issue, and we have been discussing this with the administration. What's the stance towards these new international institutions? How do they align with our agreed, because we've agreed with China on this, and all of the BRICS countries, agreed goals? So, and Paris is going to be different to the previous agreements. It was always meant to be. It's what Kyoto was meant to evolve into. It will have legal force, but I'll leave it to the lawyers to tell you what that means. It'll apply to everybody. Everybody will make an effort. Everybody will do something without being paid. We will probably have a review mechanism so we can ratchet up ambition as climate change changes. And we may have a goal of zero emissions. I'm not precisely sure, but there'll be a lot of fights over it. And if a country doesn't obey their rules, they can be sanctioned under WTO unilaterally. There's nothing stopping us. So it's the system we were looking to evolve to. Unfortunately, when we game the negotiations, this is the one output from a lot of gaming we did with negotiations. The purple line is what we need to do to get to 2 degrees. The dots, the green dot is business as usual. The red dot and the cross are 2 different scenarios. We're probably likely to go somewhere between the two. We will be a long way away from 2 degrees. Happy to answer questions on where we got that from, but it's pretty resilient. We've tested it with a lot of people. We are not going to get 2 degrees. So where does that leave us? There's no slam dunk 2 degrees. We might get a deal in the room, but that's not a success if it doesn't persuade investors and leaves us on a high impact trajectory. We could still crash and have Copenhagen 2. We need to be able to put some more money on the table or some more finance in order to persuade countries to push, particularly developing countries, vulnerable countries, to push China for stronger rules and a meaningful review process. But we also need to build beyond Paris. This isn't the end game. We need to build the coalitions that will deliver before then. And that's where US diplomacy and climate, the security community can be really useful. So the US has delivered a lot this year in moving China, even if it's not enough. It's helped in Europe, it's helped with China and India. Sorry, I'm going to flip through this, but you can read them later. This is an estimate of what action might have done, though it's got a health warning. That red line, the blue phase at the top, says what we were kind of going to, 3 to 6, 4.2 degrees. If we implemented the pledges on the table toward Paris to 2030 and ran them out to 2100, you might get around 3 degrees. That's a big difference in climate risk. That is not politically stable, because that would assume China caps its emissions and we, Europe and US, go to 0 emissions. That's what they model, which isn't politically sustainable. But it's interesting to show you can reduce exposure. It works if people deliver, but it's still way away from where you need to be on 2 degrees. So things matter, and though people still worry, they say if it's not legally binding, if you're not tied into it, will Congress reverse it? What does that mean for our energy policy? Can we reverse it? There's a lot of disquiet, and a lot of the caution in China and the caution in Europe comes from half believing the US. So people are being positive, but also retaining an ability to step back. So it's quite important for people to see a domestic political consensus form in the US, because that gives more confidence that it won't be blown off course. And understanding US national interests in terms of security is one of the things we talk about with other governments about why the US is more likely than not to keep its promises, because it understands its national interests both domestically and internationally as at risk. But what would be the security implications of failure? Just because it's good sometimes to look over the abyss to see where you are. At the moment, we are not in a really bad failure place, but we are not over the line of success. And that's a general view of senior negotiators in a negotiation. It's not my view. And so that's not going to help the security community. It's not going to keep risk below levels which are unmanageable. It's not going to help build cooperation around resilience, because if we're not cooperating on mitigation, we're not going to cooperate on resilience. We will defend ourselves, we'll fall back. And it will also impact cooperation in other areas. Let's skip through that. So what might happen if we did some of the worst scenarios for Paris? Well, there would be a big chill on energy investment for those of you in the economy. Clean energy is around 0.3 to 0.7% of GDP in the major economies, and they're political markets, and political uncertainty chills investment. You would see an unraveling of European climate legislation, for example, which would mean our energy policy was on hold for 3 or 4 years while we digested Paris. That is not good for our economies. There would also be a lot of pressure to block goods from China, and a lot of pressure on the rules-based regime. So there's going to be there would be economic consequences. There would be geopolitical consequences. What do we do if we fail to agree China, the major carbon power, and integrate it into a rules-based system? What will happen there? There'd be a major blow to European confidence, and I do not see TTIP passing in a world where Paris failed, because public opposition to it is so strong and is very tied to the green movement, environmental movement. It would see as an unbalanced agreement. And I think we'd see a drop of public belief that the international system could deliver stability and security. This is the big multilateral game in town. It's the one big one left. Is it really going to deliver for people? So it supports a kind of defensive geopolitics area. It would also undermine things like the US-Philippines relationship, an area where climate change and impacts and response from the US military and military relationships come together. And we could perhaps talk about that more. We're seeing you can't look like you're not supporting someone else's national interest and expect to support your national interest. And Philippines has made some pretty big political moves in the climate negotiations, encouraged heavily by the administration to distance itself from China and India, who are its neighbors. So those alliances are now completely wrapped together: security, diplomacy, climate change. And I'm going to just pop through this. So, and on security and stability, what would this mean the day after Paris? Well, the day after Paris, in the security world, you would have to raise all your planning assumptions for strategic risk, for bases, for equipment, for disaster response load. Because you can't assume we're going to control risk. You have to look at some of those high-risk 5, 6 degree scenarios. We would see adaptation pull back. You know, Europe would pull back its adaptation to its borders, not look at Africa. There would be no point, to be honest, to try and do adaptation in Africa if you're in these extreme scenarios. So you would start to have the ungoverned spaces issue coming out really strongly. And the idea we were cooperating on global resilience, food security, transboundary water agreements, disaster response. So we would be in crisis overload, and we're already in a bit of crisis overload at the moment. So that's a nasty scenario. So that's why we want to make sure this works. But there's also an opportunity. We could make this regime support, a security supporting regime, in the broadest sense. And here's something that we could make it monitor extreme risks better. It's not very good at monitoring risks, particularly on social economic risks. We could help reduce risks, responding to the worst case scenarios, and we could have better managing risks in terms of international cooperation. And one of the discussions we've been having in Washington is, what do we do this year? There is a G7 foreign ministers, Jeff is involved in it, discussing climate security. What could they agree? Which would show we're building resilience, we're building a balanced regime that doesn't just reduce emissions and doesn't care about poor countries, although poor countries think we don't care about them. And that makes them very distrustful of us in the negotiations. So it has a negotiation benefit and a security benefit. Well, we could agree that we were going to put conflict sensitivity and all adaptation response. We could, particularly post-conflict reconstruction, where actually we tend to build in instability through our response in, say, Pakistan. We could put much more funding into monitoring systems, and I know there's some work ongoing here and in the UK on this, looking at stress in fragile areas. Environmental refugees, rights and responsibilities, transboundary water and fisheries agreements. And who's going to drive this? Who's going to drive the institutional reform? You know, you can't be driven from Washington or London or Berlin or Paris. Do we argue the UN Secretary General should have more powers, a special representative? Whose role is it? Because if there's no one doing it, it's not going to get done. So again, not the whole system, it's not going to be done in a day, but just trying to start building a parallel effort on resilience. So, concluding points. Security actors have a strong stake in the outcome of the Paris climate negotiations and the other processes this year. And the first one is how to support, by making the consequences of failure clear, keeping 2 degrees credibly within reach. I see lots of writing from the foreign policy community about how important TTIP is. TTIP is a fly speck economically compared to Paris. I'm happy to go into the numbers. It is tiny and unimportant. But we see far more attention focused on that as a foundation of the new rules order than the Paris regime, which I think is economically and geopolitically much more important. That's a choice. Why? Because there's a stronger community arguing on trade. And so that's why we need security and foreign policy actors to make that case and keep this on the priority agenda, because I'm telling you, it isn't. Unless Kerry or Obama are in the room, it's not on the top list after Ukraine, ISIS, terrorism. There's a lot of distractions in 2015, and short-term issues are important, but they're not everything. But also, this positive agenda gives us a chance to build something stronger and better, and really argue for a broader-based regime that is not so led by environment ministries and not so led focused on mitigation. And coming back, the urgent cannot displace the important, which means we finally get to the egg, which I promised I'd come back to. So the egg is what I always present to particularly senior leaders, to say, you can get lots of science, but in the end, this is a gut decision. I've told you the world is fragile, the climate system is fragile, it's like an egg. And it has massive tipping points. We know that from the past, we know from the geology. So it's near the edge of a table. And we know we're poking it by raising carbon emissions, because we know carbon emissions are way above where they've been over the last 2 million years. And so the question is, this is it. In your gut, how much climate risk do you take? How much do you want to poke that egg? Are you going to fall off the table? Is the table high off the ground or low off the ground? Is it a hard-boiled egg or a soft-boiled egg? Because unless you have a gut feeling of how much risk you're going to take, you will not prioritize this to reduce that risk. And at the moment, we do not have that discussion at the top level, in the officials' discussions across the Atlantic, or at the public. And that's why we're not going to get a 2-degree agreement in Paris, not because we don't know how to do it, but because we haven't built the political consensus that that's a risk worth avoiding, so we're not going to avoid it. And again, I think the security and foreign policy community is quite good at talking about risk and having public conversations about risk, and that's where, post-Paris, we need to take this work so we actually do avoid the unmanageable, as John Holdren says. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Wow. There's a lot packed in there, a lot for us to think about, a lot of food for thought. So one question that I have for you before we get on to some comments from Jeff. Very often you use the term resiliency and resilience. You talk about low carbon resilient development, climate resilience, the resilience of countries, global resilience. And there's a lot of reaction around this term resilience. Can you just tell us a little bit what you mean by resilience when you think of climate and climate security?
We tend to use resilience instead of adaptation, which is too narrowly technical, and to include the concept that there are things you can't, and it assumes you can adapt to everything when of course you can't. So we use resilience as a, and I know that there's lots of debates about it, as a broad term, so not a term of art, but a broad term to say how investment that allows us to maintain the functions and services we want, stability, peace, the economy, well-being, in the face of volatility and shocks, which are often interlinked and are not just directly from climate, which are going to be growing. So it's a dynamic term, it's a dynamic process, it's all about risk. We find people understand it more than risk management, which is probably more of our term of art. And so that's how we try and use it generally. What is really interesting is how impoverished our language is on talking about resilience, volatility, and risk in the public debate, especially with economics ministries and finance ministries who don't deal with it very well, and how poor we are at understanding how systems work. So the idea that how you have to understand how fragile a system is before you can decide how much risk you take. People just look at the force and not the system. So one of the things that comes out of the resilience discussion, I think, is how it's a much deeper problem of growing a language and a set of understandings, not just defining terms, which unfortunately lots of these things sometimes end up into.
Great. Thank you. I look forward to getting into the discussion further. We're going to hear a little bit now from our colleague, Jeff DeBellico. Jeff is going to speak for about 10 minutes. As many of you know, he's the Director of Environmental Studies at Ohio University's Zunovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. And he remains a senior advisor to our program here at the Wilson Center, the Environmental Change and Security Program. And he also serves as an adjunct professor at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. Jeff is a longtime voice and champion on these issues, and many of you know that he was an IPCC lead author for the Fifth Assessment Working Group 2, Chapter 12, and a member of the UN Environment Program's UNEP Experts Advisory Group on Environment, Conflict, and Peace Building. So Jeff, I'd like to hand it over for you for your thoughts, comments, reactions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Roger Mark. And it's great to see you all, if not be there with you. Nick is somebody who has been such a rich contributor to these discussions. He and his colleagues have really figured out how to translate the research and bring it into the policy discussions in ways that make sense, that are pitched at the right time, most importantly, and the right audiences, and with really productive ideas. And so this presentation, not surprisingly, hits a lot of those notes. And so I'll just make a few comments where really I amplify and agree rather than take issue, and then of course focus on some of the challenges that I see are particularly vexing that Nick has raised as well. I want to strongly endorse this notion up front, the header of one of the slides about we need to assume that the future is not going to look like the past. Even if it does, we need to assume that and plan on the fact that it's not likely to be the case. And I think both the science that Nick presented as well as our responses or lack of responses suggest that would be wise, particularly, again, adopting this risk perspective that I think is so productive and one of the things the security community brings to the table in very productive ways. I also like the fact that I think up front, as we set the foundations for this discussion, Nick stressed this outdated notion of vulnerability to climate change, where we just assumed wealthy countries were wealthy enough to build the higher seawall, literally and figuratively. And that, as some of the data and analysis that Nick presented, is just not the case. But I can't, I guess, overstate how much I think that remains an impediment to achieving some of that wider public opinion and agreement, as well as getting the policy leaders to take that on. So that remains to be, I think, a top priority that we flag and try to operationalize whenever we can. At the same time that we want to show shared vulnerabilities and the cross-cutting ways these issues matter to all of us, I think it remains a critical dimension in bringing countries and groups, whether they're kind of country-based or thematic-based or subnationally based, bring it along by understanding what these issues mean in specific and local contexts. And that, of course, is challenging when we bring it up to the level of international negotiations and diplomacy. But I think going through those specific contexts are important. And the Philippines example gives us one, whether it is their specific high levels of vulnerability, but also what that then means for building coalitions and getting to yes or getting to more serious actions is a kind of a critical way for us to tackle these problems and bring them down to specific places and specific dynamics. Yet, as I said, while the impacts and the views are individual and specific, we obviously still need the collective response. And so the mitigation response is key to heading off some of the worst scenarios that Nick presents. I do think that whether we're calling it adaptation or resilience, I think the fact that we seem to have finally put behind us the notion that it's a zero-sum game with mitigation. Again, this is maybe more the political rather than the empirical. But I know in the U.S. context, for many years, those of us working on these issues continued to be frustrated by the unwillingness of senior leadership to see adaptation as something that was not just what we need to do for its own sake, but as a critical avenue to getting buy-in from potentially recalcitrant and often high vulnerability partners in these negotiations. And so I think the security lens has given us a sense in very specific ways on how that vulnerability and potential positive steps towards adaptation or building resilience can be a way to initially engage in dialogue that will hopefully bear fruit in a more serious conversation on the mitigation side. So understanding the connections between resilience and adaptation efforts and mitigation is one that we see in Nick's comments and in these, I think, more robust notions of how we tackle these issues, how we bring a security perspective into the multilateral processes. I think Nick's representation of external actors continuing to be skeptical of U.S. momentum and changed leadership is has some basis, and so is understandable and therefore critical that we continue to push forward in positive directions. I guess I would say at the same time, one of the failures that our friends, whether they are in Europe or other places, I've found on a number of instances failed to fully appreciate is how much dynamism and how important action, innovation, and ultimately the potential for political momentum and pressure to come from real advances at local levels, state levels. That's the history of making environmental progress in the United States. This issue, we shouldn't be surprised to see it as any different, but those who are actually dealing with these challenges and increased vulnerability and variability and change are the ones really having to deal with it. And so in this case, it doesn't mean that we can tolerate lack of activity or followership in Washington, but in some ways we need to understand that it may not be as surprising if that continues to be the case. Just to highlight a couple challenges that Nick and his colleagues certainly know well, but I would just maybe underline. As he said, and somewhat jokingly, but I know he meant it for real, and I would just say it continues to be both the straightforward point, but one that is fundamental to successfully bringing the security questions into the international diplomatic set, is that we really do have different understandings of what security means depending on where you sit. And in the US, that does have a heavy presumption that is about traditional security concerns, and the traditional security institutions are the ones there. I think it is rightly so a wider frame that is productive in these contexts. I think if it stays in that narrow frame, it has much more limited utility, even while we can recognize that risk analysis and acting in the face of uncertainty and scenarios and such are things that traditional security community very productively brings to the table. But establishing quite firmly that we have this security frame that highlights the economic, the environmental, and the traditional security, the poverty, the livelihoods frame, highly important and remains a challenge, and so it's good to have it included. And I do think that risk is a way to bring some of those folks together. The challenge really, I think, in integrating security into the climate process comes in part without us making some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. And so without the security frame coming across, either because that is all that's to it, or because it's all it's perceived to be to it, as just a rhetorical tool. And this is something particularly resonant in the US context, where the perception 8 years ago, say, starting 7-8 years ago when we started getting serious about this discussion, was the notion that it was the same message, the same ask, just from a more palatable spokesperson. And that so in 2009 for Copenhagen and our domestic efforts to pass a cap and trade bill, it was a security frame, yet the exact same ask. And so wasn't ultimately very effective in bringing on board some of the skeptical actors, and reinforced for me the critical notion of having to differentiate and have a more robust understanding of both the tools that can positively be brought from that security community into this discussion, such as risk, as well as really going to the trouble of distinguishing what the impacts are for that traditional sector and the broader notion. And so that's something that I think we have learned our lesson, but unfortunately not all actors have, particularly those who aren't as steeped in the history of how these issues have been brought together. I do think also we've seen enough examples, particularly in international negotiations, but even maybe permit me the bringing it down one level to say transboundary water agreements and the negotiation strategy of moving from a rights to needs to benefits approach to sharing waters. All the parties in doing that in senior level negotiations recognized that these were high politics security threats. At the same time, most of those actors saw it as more challenging to explicitly state it as such. And so we have constantly struggled at the Wilson Center, as has this whole field, with the notion of how do we pursue environmental security or climate security without that very frame making it more difficult to achieve, even as we recognize and agree that it is a high priority in that context. And so in that way, this goes back to how security as a definition is perceived. It remains a challenge for us to rightly recognize the high stakes that are involved, and at the same time not let some of our biases in language make it harder to achieve what we want. I think making sure to enunciate that broad notion and having that kind of robust list of what this applies in terms of threats, but also what opportunities are there that Nick has laid out as a way to kind of make sure that we avoid some of these challenges. So in that sense, getting our climate change institutions to work at lower levels for implementation, so how ultimately at the end of the day these high-level global negotiations need to bring it down, getting that done in an appropriate and effective way, I think ultimately does come down to moving beyond the climate change institutions and doing it. So all institutions bring this in, and that we have these horrible terms like mainstreaming and institutionalizing, but in that sense, making sure, and security is a step to do that, making sure we don't just limit this to a discussion of the quote unquote formal climate change institutions. That will, in part, I think, help us avoid some of the challenges like the backdraft creating conflict or exacerbating conflict that might come with how we respond to climate change, an issue at the Wilson Center worked a lot with. But I think, as I said, the agenda that Nick and E3G have outlined with some of these specific ways forward give us some very meaningful, specific, and tangible avenues for why it's beneficial to put these things together, why now is the time that we really need to do it, and that doing it in a way that understands the history and the strengths and the weaknesses of, or the challenges, we'll say, of doing that in a concerted fashion is the right time to be discussing about it now. So thanks so much, Roger Bark, and thanks, Nick, for your comments.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. I think those you raised a number of important points that build off of some of the framing that we had from Nick. Nick, I wanted to go back and read back for you a phrase that you used to describe the climate regime. You said it was risky, bouncy, and volatile, and that was the system. Some may use those same words to describe the UNFCCC process. So the question that I have for you is, in your opinion, as you look at the UNFCCC process and you look at when this came into play, what are your thoughts about the fact that this came into play built on facts and assumptions that were valid when these efforts started before 1992, but may not necessarily hold up today? And I think of, we think of the industrial and financial exponential rise of China and India, for example, our evolving understanding of the climate threat, and sort of a more nuanced understanding of the dynamics involved and the level of effort necessary to change how the entire world uses energy. So not a small set of questions, but do you, I know you make this case for climate diplomacy and its importance and how it's tied to what's happening elsewhere, but tell us a little bit more about your confidence in the UNFCCC process.
Okay, it's a huge question, but I'll try and do it into 3 points. I think there are a lot of myths about the UNFCCC process, and I'm sorry, many of them are here in Washington, and my biggest hate is the word, the firewall. That there is a firewall, especially in the Kyoto process between developed and developing countries. I was at Kyoto, there was not. It was not designed that way. We had a list of countries drawn up at the time, which is expected to evolve. And at the time of Kyoto, Argentina was saying, well, am I going to what list or what list? And Turkey was on the boundaries. And it was assumed that the deal was we would act first in the rich world, and the next time we came to a negotiation, the others would join in. I was writing papers, others were writing papers on China and the rise of China and the lock-in to Chinese coal, all in the mid-90s. This was not unanticipated. It's pretty easy to see the rise of China. It wasn't a mystery out there. But you'd think people would go, oh, we were all shocked by it. So that's one myth. The system was flexible. It was designed to be flexible. It was really the fact the US wasn't prepared to play that the deal broke. The US wouldn't act. The deal broke down, and we got where we are. But you never really get to where you're going in a straight line in this world. One of the things that's a myth, that one's a secret, actually. There's a secret about the UN regime, which is when we were at Kyoto, we thought that stabilizing emissions and around 2050 would be enough to avoid the worst consequence of climate change. So the sneaky thing that's happened that no one's noticed was that the science of climate change has got a lot worse between now and then. So the limits, the pace of change is not 2 generations of capital away, which we thought it was. It's 1 generation of capital investment away. So so it's not that people said, oh, we failed. It's because the science got a lot worse over that period. And I remember fighting with Greenpeace. Greenpeace were right again. WWF was wrong. It thought we could have much weaker emissions reductions, and Greenpeace was right. They've been right about lots of things. They will get no credit for this. So I'm now going to give Greenpeace credit for being an outlier. As anybody does forecasting, outliers very rarely get credit from the people who were safely in the pack in the middle where we were. So that's and so it's a lot more flexible and responsive than people think. But the problem is, and this leads on, it's too thin. The number of people who actually understand this regime compared to who understand trade is minute. The ecosystem of think tanks around it is minute, considering the economic 90 trillion. We're trying to coordinate the complete rewiring of the world's whole energy system, and agriculture, and all of the resilience systems. And if you think about the depth of study around it, of the number of staff members, the fact it's still run from environment ministries, it's ridiculous, the size of the problem. So as we've moved from identify problem, think about what you have to do, to implementation, the success of our approach has opened up the need to engage with a huge number of different institutions, ideas, finance, infrastructure, and the human capital around this problem has not grown commensurately. So we're kind of lagging behind the change challenge. And the trick about climate change is it's a race. If you have a 10-year delay in solving poverty, people suffer, but it doesn't stop you being able to solve poverty. If you have a 10-year delay in solving climate, it stops your ability to solve climate. It's a very different global problem. So this pace issue, we have not kept pace with our success, actually, and the worsening of the science. And that comes down to my last point, which is, for the and it's not the UNFCCC, for the climate regime to work, for this broad climate regime to work, we need to give it the human capital needed to make it work. In Washington, I've joined up, and we were sitting here, joining up the UK and European governments in the White House, because they saw joining up, which I hadn't seen breaks in that system, and we did the same to them. We're struggling to actually form the linkages, overcome institutional barriers, make the changes and reforms we need to do it. And we need more diplomats and more think tanks and more scientists and more commentators and more discussion and more argument. Because it's a big problem and it needs a big debate. And that's my biggest fear about the system. The reason is that it's not resilient because it's so thin. It doesn't have many buffers politically, in political discourse or in intellectually. And that means people And to be honest, the whole assessment of China is down to what the UK negotiator thinks of the Chinese negotiator. He could read telegrams from the Foreign Service, but he doesn't, because he hasn't got any time, because his department was cut by 40% after the financial crisis. So very, very practical things. You can't run this regime on the resources we're putting into it. And again, I think that's one of the areas where security community should turn around and go, you've got to put more people on this, because it's important, and we don't want to pick up the bill. It's ridiculous spending billions to pick up the bill when you could spend millions to solve the problem. But that's, anybody who works on conflict prevention will understand. That's a speech from that as well. So that's the thing. But it really is about us keeping up with our success. We are succeeding, but we're not succeeding fast enough, which is odd in policy terms. It's just different.
Yeah, okay. So Jeff, I wanted to go back to you and ask you a little bit more about the point that you made with regard to taking this down to specific and local contexts. So Nick mentioned that you are working with us at the Wilson Center on an initiative with the G7. Could you talk a little bit more about that initiative, and why is it important to have that happen at the level of a body like the G7, and how does that present an opportunity to trickle down or to spread out to other specific and local contexts?
Well, thank you, Roger Mark. I think it is of course, it's terrific that an important body and a group of countries like the G7 that take on this issue and see it with UK leadership in initiating it from a G7 meeting hosted there, and the Germans in the coming hosting of real big emphasis on this. I think the particular focus on climate change and in fragile state contexts is a obvious traditional security frame, but at the same time one that doesn't just fixate on the very narrow questions of explicit organized violence, but has that wider frame that Nick is talking about, but yet a different set of challenges in countries that have a variety of extra burdens in responding to climate change, adapting to it, being resilient in the face of it, and contributing on the mitigation side. And so in this context, the very rich discussions that come from that provide an opportunity to go one level below the global frames and the global numbers, and look how we have to have that global frame, global context, but at the same time bring it down into specific ones where all countries aren't the same. And so there are a specific set of challenges that are there for countries that have a more fragile condition. And so in that sense, I hope it will be something that obviously has started a conversation or joined a conversation that was going, raised it up in terms of priority and attention, and hope will provide some avenues for practical action, whether that is bilateral or multilateral, or the wider contexts that come with these intergovernmental processes.
I just want to make one comment, which is the ideas which we put in this paper, and which I know the authors of the G7 paper are going to put forward. I mean, they have been around a while. They're not, working on transboundary water treaties, and some work has been done. The problems of getting them to scale and pace have been ones of institutional rigidity, political prioritization, and budgets. And the great advantage of G7s, and there's not that great advantage of G7s, having worked on many of them in government, is they can give permission to the people who want to make change inside institutions drive reform. That they can roll an issue downhill, and that is precious, precious leadership. And by making a process where we can cooperate, we can pool resources, which in this area are very scarce, so that we get a critical mass and we are more efficient at driving things forward. So there's two things: political permission and resource sharing and driving cooperative approaches are the kind of key thing a G7 can add to help move forward agendas which have been a bit stalled, to be honest, in many of our administrations over the last few years, despite some nice speeches. And that's where I think the G7 has, it can add a little bit of magic to the daily grind of trying to solve these problems.
So I have a question for both of you. Nick, you sort of ended your talk and sort of making the point of the importance of a positive agenda and why the urgent cannot displace the important. And I want to talk a little bit more about this. Jeff sort of alluded to this when he said that, you know, we're trying to bring on more actors, but it was the same ask with a security frame, and we weren't as successful. You talk about the challenges of being able to do this from a human capital perspective, and that we haven't kept pace with our success in some regards. In practical terms, be it from the perspective of government agencies, from the NGO sector, from the advocacy sector, from the research sector, and I know we talk a lot about the risk framework and why that is important. In practical terms, what do we need to be doing better or differently now to help keep the important issues on the agenda? And I throw that up for both of you.
Jeff, you want to go first?
Sure. I think one part of that is that the political calendar, which is when it comes to December in Paris, it is going to be in some ways too late. The time is now for these discussions to bring these arguments in and hopefully increase the ambition and activity and resources and coordination that we're talking about here. And so in that context, it is, it's actually in the next 4 or 5 months at the most when a lot of these decisions from the working level diplomats will get done. And so in that sense, it's urgency. G7 is one example of a variety of processes where these conversations are coming up in addition to when the formal UNFCCC process. And so finding avenues to have this discussion that are pointing and pulling and pushing in the same directions are incumbent on us doing it now. And so if you're an NGO and you want to campaign and a set of op-eds, now is the time to do it. If you are a researcher bringing out reports that are relevant to this discussion, it is now. If you are holding forums like this and visiting DC, as Nick is doing, it's doing it now and not expecting November to be the time or December to be the time to make that difference.
Yeah, I echo that. I think one of the 2015, we're going to see a rise in attention across sectors, government and non-government, and that's the time to build new coalitions of interest. And you know, what I'm trying to do with this, trying to illuminate the consequences, put meaning. You know, it's hard to, you know, it's a black box, the UN negotiations, and trying to connect it back to the real world and say, what happens the day after Paris if we succeed or if we fail? What's in it for you? We spend a lot of time with investors and businesses, foreign ministries who are saying, but I've got this on the agenda. And that's why I use the TTIP example. It's like, TTIP is tiny compared to Paris economically. And that's a discussion, you know, most finance ministries haven't even bothered looking at Paris as a financial or an economic opportunity. They don't know how big the low-carbon economy is. They don't understand their country's low-carbon exports and the fact they're the fastest-growing export sector in the world. They think it's a subsector of a subsector, to quote my finance ministry to me. So that illumination, which takes quite a lot of hard work to bring things together, integrate, and then simplify, so get the data right and then make it meaningful. And the last one, which I'd love to explore with people here, I see the ecosystem around here, and I see it in conflict prevention more generally, lacks kind of effective long-term change drivers, which you often see in the environment and the development community. After the Arab Spring, we were going to put 30 billion into North Africa to stabilize it. We did some work about how that should be spent in order to maintain security given these challenges of resources and climate. And we went round to all the investment banks who were given the money, and they said, yes, we agree. We get your analysis, but we can't possibly work together to do that. Actually, what you have to do is go to the country, sort out all the problems, come back with us a financial proposition, and we'll do it. So he went to the funders and said, that's what they say. And the funders went, oh, that's a bit difficult. So he went to some NGOs who work in the area, and they said, we've got no money. So when you're trying to deal with dislocated systems that can't work across boundaries and people don't have the right mandate, you need to go in and build it. I've done that in Europe on energy problems. I can get money for that. But we need to show a few big integrated resilience investment successes, which means a 3 to 5 year process of knitting together the institution's ideas and work on the ground. And that type of investment people will copy. In the UK, we've spent 3 years building a new public bank called the Green Investment Bank with a huge coalition of people. That has now been copied 12 times around the world. Copying is how humans work. It's that first innovation, it's that first example which we haven't done. So I think that for me is one of the things I'd love to see come out of some of this work, is like a few of those country level or large regional level pilots, which actually does what all of our policy papers have been saying they should do. Because it's not going to happen on its own. If it was going to happen on its own, it would have happened already.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's open it up. So we'd like to have your thoughts, your reactions, your questions. As my colleagues come to you with the microphone, we'll ask you to give your name and your affiliation and get to your question. So we start here, please.
Commander John, I'm probably good without the mic. Commander.
We'll need it for the webcast.
Sorry, we're recording.
Got it. Sorry about that. Commander John Marburger, Navy Task Force Climate Change. So I guess the question and comment are mainly posed towards Nick. I hear what you're saying about moving too slowly. Certainly within the Navy, we face that challenge as well, although it's a bit more myopic from the size of the challenge that you're dealing with. But I wanted to make one comment and then a question. So you talked about the egg, and of course I asked my leaders the same thing. How much risk do you want to accept? And while it's not from a world standpoint, it's more from a base infrastructure standpoint or from an opening of the Arctic standpoint. I continue to be convinced that that is the right question. But after doing this now for quite some time, I'm also thoroughly convinced that our leaders are not even remotely equipped to answer that question. And so then in any situation like that, you always have to look internally about, well, what are we doing? And by we, I mean scientists, the Navy Task Force on Climate Change, the 5th and 12th ranked think tanks in the world.
You had to put that out there, huh?
Well, we're all in this together because we really have to then take and make sure that we are equipping our leaders in order to essentially transition that discussion of risk from one of a qualitative evaluation to a quantitative evaluation. And so that means really having a pretty hard discussion on probability of occurrence, the severity of the impacts should it occur, and then of course putting a time frame on that occurrence, because without those three things, you're never going to be able to get to that next diplomatic point, which is essentially taking all those diplomatic processes that can work to address the delta of risk tolerance amongst all the different actors that you're trying to get to come together. So the question is, so I guess one is, how are you guys doing that from a, getting probabilities, severity of impacts, time frame of occurrences, and really getting that marriage of science and policy together and lowering uncertainty so that you then therefore lower risk?
Should I do one by one?
Yeah, please. Great question.
It is a great question. It's one of my specialized topics, so thank you very much for asking it. I totally agree with you. As we go around, the how much risk can you take, we think works with the public at that kind of because it just highlights the idea, especially when I deal with climate skeptics. I don't care what they care about climate change. I think it's a national security problem, and I think it's part of my country's national interest. They can disagree with me. There's more people on my side than their side, and so in a democracy, that's what happens. I'm not interested in their views on the science. I have my views on the science. But when we're talking to large investors, we talk about an orderly versus a disorderly transition. Because the question for them is, how do I invest? And the question, well, if you don't control and manage these risks on both sides, mitigation, adaptation, it's going to be a very bumpy ride. And then when something goes really badly wrong, we'll have a crash program of abatement, and most of our investments will lose value. Do you want that, or do you want these people to grip it? The orderly transition is still pretty bumpy. So I don't think it's a smooth curve, which is the lie we tell our policymakers with models. But yeah, so it's a way of kind of combining risk and threat in a way that gives them a risk management framework, which is different for every decision maker set, because the world they live in is different, as you say. You have to, people, I was asked by the Foreign Office, how do we talk about climate risk? I say, tell me who you're talking to, and then we can think about designing that. I think there are three kind of bits of breaking that down that are common to everybody. One is understanding what type of decision they're making and thinking about, therefore, how risk plays into that, which we would call a risk management framework. You design around the decision. And around that, then you design the decision support. So what information do they need to illustrate that, both in a hard data sense, but also in a narrative sense, because analogy and metaphor is incredibly important. And we do a lot of that work in E3G. It's one of our main things. And on top of that, I think gaming. I wish I had the money to do the kind of gaming you do here internally, and which I used to do internally in the UK government. I know some philanthropists are funding on these scenarios. I think putting senior people in a room, gaming through complex scenarios, gives them that gut feeling, that gut understanding of where the problems are that it's virtually impossible to do in any other policy paper, grid, traffic light system, whatever the products you produce, I've produced all of them. Because a lot of this is giving them it's a judgment, a gut feeling basis for dealing with things they have not experienced. So you have to give them an experiential approach. Because how much data we put in the end, you have a group of people in a room making choices. And half of those, and the reason the questions we give them require huge amounts of judgments, because all the things that didn't require judgments we sorted out before you got to the room with the principals in. And I think and that's where I think, again, we've got a lot to learn from the military about how you train senior staff in dealing with those issues, gaming, using senior staff. Civil contingencies does a lot of it in the UK. So those would be some of the techniques. But it's an investment. It's an investment in serious reform. And one of the interesting questions back to you is, who would be able to pull the lever on doing that in your system? So who would have to realize they're not making good decisions in order to drive a reform of their decision support system? Because that's a circularity that I found quite hard to deal with in government.
We have targets.
So Jeff, I wonder if I could ask you to respond to the same question a little bit from an academic perspective. You're at a university. How are you seeing this present on campus, in academic circles, with any climate modelers that you're working with? How is this playing out in those circles?
Yeah, thank you, Roger Mark. I think it's an excellent question, and may even also draw on the experience with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where in part there are assessments of confidence levels in terms of what the science is saying or not saying, and how robust the evidence base is. I think they're quite useful, and I think lowering uncertainty with additional information analysis is quite helpful. However, I think there is still too much faith, particularly from the scientific community, that more science and more detailed understanding of the dynamics will be what has the policymakers pull that egg back from the ledge, right? But I think implied in the question, and certainly in Nick's response, it's connecting what is already a very robust scientific base with the mechanisms such as risk and this experiential scenario work that I certainly have seen that transformation happen in the collaborations we've done, including on climate with places like the U.S. Army War College. It makes a big impression and goes beyond precisely how much or how little incremental change we make in the scientific understanding. So in that sense, I think finding ways that we connect to risk analysis mechanisms, behavioral change models, and such decision-making models that kind of, as Nick says, allows for a recognition that we're not giving sufficient weight to these kinds of considerations, are where the critical dimension and progress is going to come from. In that sense, the disciplinary silos of academia are often not well matched to help provide that. At the same time, increasingly, schools that really emphasize the interdisciplinary and bringing together teams to go this extra step with translating the base knowledge, the scientific knowledge, into this more usable framework that connects better to policy folks. It's the kind of thing we're trying to teach our students. It's certainly the kind of thing we're trying to do with our research. It's not what necessarily gets funded on the research side or even in the policy side, as Nick alludes to in terms of having those resources to do it, but are critical steps in us translating science into these kinds of actionable decisions that take these issues more seriously.
I mean, there's a very clear analogy for people when you work on intelligence in government. You have your agencies who deliver you information with a certain probability attached, your collection agencies, and then you have decision makers, and between them you have, in what we call in the UK, an assessment staff who understand how intelligence is collected and turn it into actionable information. In, I'd say, the environment departments across Europe, there is no assessment staff. They have scientists and they have decision makers, and there's nothing in between. and that is a waste of time. We built under the UK's National Security Council an assessment staff on climate and resource security, which was then disbanded by the next government. We will try and reinvent that central organ. One of the areas we've been thinking of is actually driving that just from climate and resources is quite hard work. But actually, our friends on anti-terrorism, our friends on broad conflict prevention, also require that function because they're dealing with similar shaped problems. And perhaps there's a case here for broadening the coalition of people wanting a more better risk-based preventative security assessment process inside governments, and that function coming forward. So not all of us driving our own pieces, but actually joining something up to get a major security reform. And that's something we're exploring in coalition building in the UK in front of this election, for example, because opportunities will open up. But it's not that we don't do it in other areas. We're not doing that function here, which is rather silly.
Thank you. Let's go with Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. This is really interesting. Thanks for doing this panel today. I wanted to go back to the 2-degree issue. So, I hear you saying that Paris won't add up to a 2-degree deal, and we've heard that from a large number of experts now, and increasingly some leaders, right? We heard Ed Davies say that a couple weeks ago, and even Christiana Figueres alluded to it. But I also see a real concern in the environmental community that leaders are managing expectations too low when it comes to the 2-degree issues. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit actually about not necessarily the substance of the 2 degrees, but the messaging around the 2 degrees. What's going on? Is there consensus in the environmental community about what success looks like in Paris with regard to a 2-degree goal? If it doesn't add up to a 2-degree deal, do you expect major environmental groups to declare Paris a failure? What does that mean for the day after Paris? If you could hit some of those things, that'd be great.
Great. Let's take it. We have another question.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah. Give you some time to think about that.
Good, thank you.
Hello. Carly Chavera, Global Environmental Politics Program at American University. If I could, I would just like to go back to the point Professor made about the importance of the specific places and dynamics in conflict. And given that most environmental-driven conflict will happen at the subnational level in these risk places, to what extent do you feel that intrastate institutional capacity building will be emphasized at Paris, and will there be, do you feel there is a role for a discussion to be held around that? Thank you.
Thank you. So, would you like to start, Nick?
Yeah, I'll let Jeff take the second one.
Okay.
It's more his. There is no consensus, and I talk to a lot of people, from anybody, inside government, outside government, business, cities, environment NGOs, about what success at Paris looks like. And we know what we'd like in an ideal situation. But the scenarios I put up are, you have to get to just things that aren't on the table to get anywhere near that curve. So it's not, there are people trying to manage expectations. We're not one of them. We're trying to say, what does things add up to? Is there any likelihood of changing before Paris? No. Okay. How do you make sure we have a system where we can say, we're going to come back and ask for more? And that's why the review and ratchet is so important. All of the major countries, apart perhaps from the US, China and the EU will definitely deliver more than we're promising at Paris. I will bet anybody here $100 on that one. Because the European offer was held back by Poland, which is an outlier in Europe, and by a little bit lack of leadership in other countries, and the Chinese are hedging. But what we hope is when we get to 2019, when we should have a review of what we're doing in 2030, that people will feel a lot more confident. They will have done reforms, they'll have delivered below, Europe's already out, delivering 5% reductions more than its Copenhagen promise. We just can't get the polls to agree we put it on the table. So that's why I'm more optimistic that I can, stand up and say, this isn't 2 degrees yet. It is a material reduction in climate risk to you. I mean, that's one thing, Paris reduces climate risk to you, but not enough. And we're going to come back and do it again. And our discussions with all the major campaigning organizations were, the worst thing you can do is kill the process that's going to reduce climate risk to the people you're trying to protect. Because that's what the people who don't want this process to work are going to do after Paris. The people calling failure are the people who really want to burn all the gas and coal and oil. And Shell has just come out basically declaring war on the climate process yesterday, their CEO. We need to say, this isn't enough. we're not damning the process, we're damning the politicians who turned up and didn't give enough, and we're going to go back to the country and we're going to mobilize and push you to do more, working with business, working with cities, the people who pick up the tab, and the security community, of you not doing enough. And so it's not falling into the trap of making it the cup final and the Super Bowl, but realizing that we have agency to drive harder. And the way I think that is credible, if we get the right mechanisms, is because the wind of the real economy is behind us. You know, energy demand has dropped in Europe for the last 14 years, year on year. Transport demand is dropping, despite a growing population. Electricity demand is dropping. Why? Because we're getting better at using energy and we've implemented policies that work. And all the IEA projections are wrong, and all the Shell projections are wrong, and all the BP projections are wrong. We're doing much better than anybody in the dirty fuel industry expected us to do on clean energy, and we can do better. So, you know, if it was the other way around, I think it would be hard to sell. But I think because the wind is behind us in terms of the real economy and the politics is getting better in every country we work in. Just because Paris doesn't get us all the way there doesn't mean it's not worth having. But I agree, but the messaging, I mean, the tactical messaging will be tough, which is why we're spending a lot of time between now and Paris to make sure we get as much as we can out of the ambition and fight against the people who don't want to deal, who will be trying to message this as a failure, saying we should have 4 degrees. Because if you look at the science, you think 4 degrees is something you want to live with? You must be kidding. But that's what Exxon's position is. Exxon says it's easier to adapt to 4 than change the world's energy economy. That's the fight we're in.
Jeff?
Sure. Thank you very much, Carly, for your question. I think briefly, I would be pessimistic that at the level that you're suggesting, these subnational discussions for the fragile state context will have a great deal of focus. However, I think finding a way to connect to that would be critical in bringing some of these countries along. I think it will probably come up in the conversations about finance and what we will spend the money for and where it will be spent, and that those countries will be looking for opportunities to do that. And I think importantly, for us to make real progress, we need to, in those contexts, have a much broader discussion of what constitutes a climate-related response. And so I would cite the work of our friend and colleague John Barnett from the University of Melbourne, who in the small island state context, looking at countries that are facing an existential security threat vis-a-vis climate change, he points us to ways that they can lower vulnerability, increase flexibility, and make decisions. So if there is a migration scenario, it's an orderly one that has more agency and choice involved with it. And that talks about finding ways to make changes in labor mobility and increase the ability to do remittances from sectors that are not typically what we look to first and foremost as a climate adaptation or an investment in resilience. And so I think part of the key in making progress across the board is us having a much more inclusive definition of what counts and what matters in terms of how we respond to climate change. And that's both for the countries as they put forward the kinds of things they're interested in seeing investments in, and in terms of those providing the finances, seeing a much wider set of tools in the toolbox as appropriate investments in responding to climate change.
So thanks for raising that, Jeff. I think that's a really good point. Nick, when you started talking, you also talked about the importance of the financial mechanisms and what this means moving forward. I wonder whether you could talk, there's a very intense and active debate among the different actors around loss and damage and what this means and financing mechanisms, not specifically leading to Paris, but preparing for what happens after Paris for the next COP. And I wondered whether you could talk about that a little. What are your thoughts and perspective on the financing mechanisms that are being negotiated right now, and sort of what that means for those who will be most vulnerable?
Kind of 2 things. Firstly, on adaptation, we are committed, for example, in Europe, 50% of our money should go on adaptation. We're spending 20%. Why? Because there's no pipeline. Why? Because there's no business called adaptation. Building pipe walls a bit higher and pipes a bit stronger and That's not adaptation. That's just extra bits of kit. And we haven't faced up to the fact, I mean, Jeff says that we need to look at swapping, building centralized water systems for decentralized community water management, reforming of land rights, and the compensation packages needed to buy out large landowners might be a more resilient approach. Scholarship funds for kids. I actually did social transformation programs in UK fisheries. Precisely this, it was like, actually we're not going to support the fishermen, we're going to give your kids scholarships to university because that's a better idea. Or give you the choice between the two. You can have quota or scholarships, community. That's what we're suffering from. So there's a lot of discussion about lumps of money. There's more money than we know what to do with. We're wasting it at the moment. We need to think about quality and building those pipelines and reforms at the national level to make it actually result in resilience. The amusing thing is that there's got a whole discussion at the UNFCCC, and people take very kind of, principled stands here and in EU about loss and damage. It's too premature to have that discussion at the UN because none of us have done it at home. I mean, the US is furthest advanced in thinking about loss and damage, but we do work across Europe on this. There are rules on compensation inside the European economies, which is there isn't any. The firm and settled policy of the UK Treasury, the German Treasury, and the French Treasury is that there shall be no compensation for climate damage. The costs of climate damage fall on the citizen and the business, except when they're big businesses and are good at lobbying because they get subsidies. And it's your job to manage that risk, even though, of course, you have no control over managing it. Insurance companies' risk management plan don't insure people. That's their risk management plan. We don't have socialized insurance in Europe. It's illegal. So we don't have government backing, except in very, very specific places where Brussels allows it. So if it's too much risk, the insurers just don't insure anymore. That's welcome to our loss and damage structure. So there is no social contract on climate risk in any country, let alone internationally. So the good thing about the loss and damage discussion at the international place is it started to drive these national debates, which is about who wins and who loses, which again starts to build a national conversation on how much risk we take. Because one of the reasons why people do not get excited about climate change yet is they don't realize, except in friends in Florida who can't get insurance, that the insurance, for example, in many European countries now, cities, your insurance on your house is conditional on your local authority doing an adaptation plan which is funded by central government, which has just been cut. And if they don't do that, your insurer does not have to pay you. That, people do not realize that yet, that the fate of their house is in the hands of the finance ministry in the central government funding enough climate adaptation and resilience and their local authority spending it properly. So I think that's why I think this is the day after Paris. Those are the conversations, really practical on-the-ground conversations about who wins and who loses, who's hiding risk, who's bearing risk, which we need to do, because that's the politics of climate change, nationally. On that basis, we might actually have to have an international one, but I think it's one of the places where the international has opened a space nationally, in developed countries in particular, I think, but also in China, which really goes to the heart of some pretty core issues about winners and losers and rights and responsibilities in this debate. But it's, I think if we just keep it about money at the international level, it'll be quite sad. But if you broaden it out, it becomes a very exciting debate, actually, which could really move us to a more realistic discussion of this issue.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought in the insurance industry. More questions, comments? No one else? Lisa.
Thanks. Can you talk about how you think this issue of differentiation is going to play out in the talks? I mean, do you think that the U.S. idea of self-differentiation is going to win by default, or are there other ideas that are gaining steam?
Yes. Again, one of the myths of the climate regime is that there was some type of big negotiation where there was a formula written to differentiate between countries and it allocated emissions. It's never been like that. It's always been countries rocking up and saying what they're prepared to do. Kyoto was like that. It's always been a blend of bottom up and top down. So in Kyoto, the Russians came up with, and the Australians, with ridiculous last minute emissions non-reductions after the major powers had negotiated with each other, not on a formula, but sitting in a room horse trading percentage points of emissions reductions. It was quite amusing. It was all quite fantasy. So it will be self-differentiation because that's what politics is. There will be it'll be quite important to have some kind of theoretical, some idea of fairness around it, which the Brazilian proposal or some of the other ones might give too, so people feel there's a kind of fairness to it. But I think the SO2 rules in US showed what happens when you ask people to write a fairness rule. I think there were something like 45 fairness rules written, one by each state, which, funnily enough, all of them made that state get the largest allocation of SO2 principles. It's very hard to divide up pies anywhere. It's much easier to negotiate them. So that's what's going to happen.
Well, yes, one final question from Lisa.
Lisa Palmer. I'm a journalist and a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. My question has to do around one of your slides, which had, you breezed over it somewhat. The 64% of are exposed to natural catastrophes in the U.S. Can you talk a little bit about what that kind of information could do if people knew more about it?
Yeah, as I said, it's interesting if you looking at the history of policy is really illuminating. We don't do enough of it. And the assumptions were made, if you read a lot of the environmental economics and game theory over the climate negotiations from the 90s and the early 2000s where it was funded, were that the US intrinsically was less damaged than other countries. China and India would bear the biggest damages because the largest populations, but the US was very resilient. And that was why the US was playing hardball, and it was kind of a realist, rationalist view of why the US was doing what the US did, and why it was going to make everybody do more than the US did. And no one really questioned that assumption, and people did little studies on impacts in the US, and people in the US thought we're big and we've got lots of climatic zones, we can do it. But the revealed impacts of the world, 1.3% of US GDP destroyed by extreme weather events in 2013, that's no growth. I mean, GDP figures didn't change because you were just rebuilding stuff that was broken. It wasn't human damage. That's just pure stuff that Munich measures. It turns out the US is highly vulnerable to extreme weather events and seems to be being impacted by more extreme weather events more than any other developed country. Japan is very relaxed about its climate exposure compared to the US, and the insurance bears it out, and so is Europe, and the insurance data bears it out. I think if the US realized that it was despite a national mythos of battling the wilderness as opposed to tending the garden, if you read some of the interesting work by Pew on different approaches to nature in different countries, it would make people realize that the US national interest is in getting China to lower its emissions. For so long, the narrative in this, particularly in Washington, was the world is trying to constrain the US. The Lilliputians are trying to hold us down, us giant. That's not what it is anymore. The US needs to constrain China and India and the rest of the developing world to preserve US security, and it turns out you're a lot more vulnerable than you thought you were. It might be hard psychologically to deal with being an asker rather than a dictator. And the British Empire, the British Civil Service has a problem with that too, to be honest. So it can last a long time with post-imperial. But it just, for this issue only, actually, in the world, it is true that China is top dog. And so we better play nicely with them. And I think the administration has done a very good job of engaging with China on those grounds, but it hasn't really sunk in here that you are not in control of your security. And Paris is the only way you get in control of your security, because you try doing it bilaterally with China, you will get a much worse deal than if you're working with Europe and Latin America and India to make sure China takes into account our security when it abates, not just its own security and interests. That's the bottom line. And so that's what I would, I was surprised by that data, and I think people here might be surprised by it. Perhaps it's something we should put more time into making clear. Who benefits from a good Paris outcome? It's not Europe as much as it's the US.
Thank you. I think we've had a really rich discussion this morning. There's sort of 4 key things that come out for me from this discussion. I really was very grateful to the questions that came from you, but also from Nick and Jeff, in getting into a little bit at the subnational level. What does this mean in terms of specific and local context? I was very pleased that that came out in the discussion this morning. I think we also had a very interesting discussion around questions of adaptation and resilience and sort of the degree to which we've moved beyond just talking about mitigation and how security fits in to that discourse and what that means for us ultimately. I think adjacent to that and central to that was a question of U.S. positioning. You know, Nick told us that there was somewhat of a positive reaction that the U.S. was able to successfully continue to drive the negotiations, but at the same time, a lot of need for recognition of our particular climate vulnerabilities within the United States and what that means moving forward. You know, ultimately, who wins from the Paris negotiations and what does that mean for us here in the United States? I think we also had a dimension to our discussion, which was the practical side of it. What can all of us be doing in this room, recognizing that this whole system is not resilient in itself? There are not buffers, as Nick spoke about. There's an importance for diplomacy moving forward. But what does it mean in terms of how we think of our work and opportunities to take action now? And then finally, this discussion around what is urgent versus what's important, what's the role of risk and decision making in that context, and how far do we want to push the egg, and how do we continue to pose that question in real and meaningful ways. So please join me in thanking Nick and Jeff for having that discussion with us. Before you leave, I just wanted to point out a couple things. Nick, in his presentation, specifically spoke about community mobilization around coal and what that means in countries like India. We at the Wilson Center, our Environmental Change and Security Program, has just produced a film that's a 10-minute documentary that specifically looks at this question of coal, energy, and water in India. It's called Broken Landscape, and if you go to our website, newsecuritybeat.org, go to Broken Landscape and you can view the film there. It's a magnificent film, just 10 minutes long, but you see this sort of community response to these challenges on the ground. Nick's slides are available. He had a lot packed in there, very rich, and I think if you can really go back and look at them and go through a lot of what he's presented, it's very compelling. They will be available. They are available on our website at newsecuritybeat.org. We will also have the video recording of today's session, as well as a summary of what we've covered today. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. That's great. Thanks, Jeff.